Earlier, earlier in the week, I had read a story from the horror commentary by Jim Trombetta, but this here isn't one of the comic stories. It's a two-page commentary I hope a lot of you will find quite interesting. The comics code was already enforced when EC Comics publisher William M. Gaines and editor Al Feldstein co-wrote Judgment Day, a story that was almost an act of reparation for racist imagery in comics. It became, ironically, a milestone in censorship. Originally published without censorship in Weird Fantasy number 18, cover dated March-April 1953, Judgment Day was later reprinted in Incredible Science Fiction number 33, cover dated January-February 1956, the last comic book Bill Gaines published, replacing a story about mutants, which Charles F. Murphy, the former magistrate who had become the administrator of the Comics Code, had squelched. "You can't have mutants," Murphy had said. Illustrated by Joe Orlando, Judgment Day was about Tarleton, a man whose face is concealed by a helmet that allows him to breathe, and who evaluates an alien planet for membership in the Galactic Republic. The world in question is populated by two kinds of robots, blue and orange. The blues are in charge. They consider the orange ones inferior and force them to live as second-class citizens. Taking note of these conditions, Tarleton insists on a tour of the robot factory, where he points out that all robots are made of the same components and only their shells are different, destroying the rationale for color discrimination. He then gives his verdict. The robot civilization may not join the Republic until it treats all robots equally. When he gets back to his ship, Tarleton removes his helmet, allowing the reader to see his face for the first time. The description of him reads, and the instrument lights made the beads of perspiration on his dark skin twinkle like distant stars. Tarleton is a black man, an excellent twist in its day, and one that, for some, still seems to do the trick. In 1955, this story exercised a fair amount of torsion in the brain of Charles F. Murphy. Al Feldstein had to get this story, like all other stories, approved by Murphy for the code. Feldstein related his account of the scene to David Hadju. He got to the last panel and he looked up at me and he said, No, you can't have a Negro. I said, why not? He said, you can't have a Negro. I said, where in the code does it say that I can't depict a Negro? He said, I say you can't have a Negro. I said, that's the whole point of the story. No. Feldstein returned to the EC offices where a livid Gaines called Murphy to protest, threatening to expose him as an opponent of racial equality. Murphy quickly backpedaled, saying that EC could use the black character, but only if the quote-unquote beads of perspiration were wiped off his face. Gaines said, fuck you, hung up, and published the story once again, complete with perspiration, just as he had 2 years earlier. Clearly, successful censorship is not a logical but a viral phenomenon. In other words, give it an inch and it takes light years. Once horror comics were forbidden, science fiction as a serious comics genre also had to go. Charles F. Murphy's problems with the other gorgeously drawn, densely literate, and rather cerebral weird fantasy stories are exemplary. It wasn't sex or sensationalism Murphy wished to remove from the story Judgment Day, because there wasn't any. It was the sheer irreversibility of time that scared him. You can't have a Negro, and no mutants either. Perhaps Murphy would have liked to have seen his own face under Tarleton's helmet, but not at the price of actually freeing anyone or anybody. One thread of science fiction was that the simplistic rules of the comics code couldn't outlaw this kind of cerebral but non-sensational shock that the genre, traveling from horror to awe, was able to deliver. For instance, The Report from Tomb of Terror number 16, cover dated July 1954, illustrated by Bob Powell, leaves the code a long way behind. The story, controversial for its time, is even more so now. But Charles F. Murphy's own problem with the genre does not appear quite so sophisticated. It seems, ironically, similar to a major theme in the work of science fiction great Philip K. Dick. That is, if you look into the future long enough, you're bound to see yourself dead in it. And here is the final illustration of the story as seen. Inside the ship, the man removed his space helmet, etc., etc. And there you see the beads of perspiration that Murphy wanted removed. And this was in the midst of all the bullshit that was going on in comics in general. But that was the first time I'd read anything not involving, bondage or child endangerment, overly gruesome scenes. And it's sad, really, just to think that anybody thought that way back then. And, of course, there are people who would think that way even now. Not so much about a comic, but about real life. Anyhow, not trying to make any comment myself. I just thought that since I read, Bargaining with the Worm, one of the more stranger stories in this collection of comics and commentary from the 50s, that this 2-page article and one panel of comic art and text made me take pause. So I hope it does the same for you. Peace. June 5th, 2011. Wayne Allen Sally, Burbank, Illinois.